If you want access to my entire library of past webinars, as well as access to future ones, head over to daringventuresathome.com or click the link in the description below. Some ground rules for grief work, just some basic principles that I think we have to adopt in order to move through grief. And the first is this: every single grief involves a death. It doesn't have to be the physical death of a person, but something has died. So in the case of betrayal, that can be a lot of different things, but what I hear most often, the story we shared as I knew it, there were problems, there were challenges, but it was our story, and that is gone in light of what I now know. The other thing that often dies is hopes and dreams for the future. I had an expectation that life was going to be this with you, that we were about to retire and we were going to do the grandparent thing and we were going to travel around, and now I don't know if I want to be in an RV with you, and I don't know if our grandchildren will get to enjoy us as grandparents together, and I don't know how much money I'm going to have to spend on therapy, and is that going to enable us to do what we wanted to do? And so there's this loss of an anticipated future and the dreams attached to that. So that's ground rule number one. Number two, things will never be the same. And this is where I say to any of you who are listening who did the betraying, you can't just say, oh, I'll never do that again, and think that you're going to be able to pick up where things left off, even if in fact you never do it again, because that old marriage, that old relationship is dead. Your betrayed partner will never be able to unknow what she or he now knows that for so long they did not know. So things will never ever be the same. And then ground rule number three, and here's the one that if you're early in this process, you may want to disagree with me, shake your fist at me. You might even turn this podcast off. That's okay. Bookmark it, because maybe you'll come back to it later on in your journey. Things can be different and maybe even better. So now that we've talked about kind of those ground rules for grief work, let's transition that over into phases of grief work. And I see three phases. They actually align with those ground rules. So first ground rule, remember, every grief involves a death. Phase one is about answering the question, what is dead? The second ground rule, things will never be the same. So phase two is about what is new, answering the question, what is new? And I want to be clear about this. Asking what's new is not expecting the answers to all be good. Sometimes what's new are really hard things. The third phase of grief work corresponds to the third rule. Things can be different, even better. So phase three is answering the question, what's next? So those three questions: what is dead? What is new? What is next? Another thing I want to be clear about, you don't, go to sleep in phase one and wake up in phase two, never to return. There's overlap here. There's some back and forth here. It's not an entirely linear process. Ask yourself, are you ready? And here's some markers for that. If you're still living a lot of your life in that state of hypervigilance, hyper arousal, like your nervous system is on fire, on edge, if you're still experiencing lots and lots of trauma triggers, you may not yet be ready to start grief, because it sounds like there's still a need for safety and stability. What additional boundaries, what additional support, what additional self-regulation and grounding tools might you be able to use to begin to lower some of that reactivity? And what I think you'll begin to notice is a transition from trauma triggers to what I call grief waves. And here's how I distinguish between those two. When I talk about trauma triggers with someone, I kind of put my hands up around my head and kind of shake it it's up here. It's this in my mind, on alert. My eyes are darting back and forth. I'm looking around. I'm hypervigilant, kind of taken outside of myself and just looking all around for the threat. That's trauma trigger versus a grief wave where I'm going to put my hands lower down in my body. It's a deeper experience of more like pain, a deeper experience of loss, a deeper experience of sadness or fear or even anger. But it's not that ringing, hypervigilant, racing thoughts kind of thing. It's a deeper, it wells up within me. Being in grief is like wading out into the waters of the ocean. Okay, I'm going to wade out into the water. I'm having the waters hit me. I've kind of waded out to where they're hitting me at my chest. And then sometimes all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this big wave comes and smacks me upside the head out of nowhere just comes up and surprises me. That's often what happens in grief. I'm doing okay. I've been having a good day, a good week, and then seemingly out of nowhere, welling up from within me is a wave of sadness, a wave of loss, a wave of anger, a wave of fear, a wave of shame, or whatever it is. So if you've begun to experience a little bit of that transition where you're coming down out of the hypervigilance of the trauma and feeling more of the deeper, intense emotions of grief, then maybe it's time to start doing, in a really intentional way, some formal grief work. So here's some ideas for that.